ESPN reporter Dan Graziano went through the whole NFL landscape, looking at potential offseason trades and cut candidates. And one of the guys that obviously was mentioned, and you kind of referenced it, is Deebo. And he highlights, that the Niners have made a bunch of investments in wide receivers, with Pearsall taking 31st, and Juwan, they extended Juwan Jennings' contract. They got the deal done with Ayuk, signing him to a long-term deal. He's one of the highest paid receivers in the league. And he thinks these moves leave Deebo as the odd man out. And here's the quote from Graziano. He says, Deebo Samuel's contract structure is interesting. He'll make about $16.6 million next year, but about $15.4 million of that is in the form of an option bonus the team has to decide on before the 10th day of the league year in March. So the Niners could trade him before that date, leaving his new team responsible for that 2025 cash, but the Niners would carry a dead money charge of $31.55 million on their 2025 cap. They said releasing Samuel could be the better way to go, because if you release him and designate him as a post-June 1st cut, you would allow to defray that cost over 2 years. If they decide to move on, that's the more likely decision. So he's saying that this might be the final year with Deebo, and that they would cut him. Man, that seems so hard to envision when you think about Shanahan and how much he loves Deebo. I mean, if there's anybody that he might, if you said to me, name Kyle Shanahan's favorite player, I'd probably say Deebo.
He loves Deebo, and he utilizes Deebo in a very fascinating way. And going into this year, since being drafted, Deebo was number 1 in the NFL among all wide receivers and picking up yards after the catch. We've seen him be able to break tackles at an extraordinarily high rate. This year, though, his lack of separation is down. His tackle breaking is down. And while Deebo throughout his career has been one of the more fascinating overall offensive skill players and weapons in the NFL, who is truly one of one with the way that he plays, with physicality, with speed, with the way that Kyle Shanahan utilizes him, he's been a disappointment since the Niners signed him to that contract extension after the 2021 season. And Deebo has now been in the league for 6 years, Larry. He has more than 1,000 receiving yards just once. And I think we've seen a slight decline in his game as a receiver because of the lack of separation, the lack of tackle breaking, but also Kyle Shanahan has loved using him as a little bit of that wide back running back. And in that role, I don't think that play works anymore. He's averaging 3.1 yards per attempt on the ground. That is by far the lowest mark of his career. And when you think back to that 2021 season, one of the more special seasons that I can remember from a wide receiver and offensive weapon. 77 catches, 1,400 yards. He led the NFL in yards per catch at 18.2. And he had, through the air, 6 touchdowns. And then on the ground, 59 carries, 365 yards, 8 touchdowns, 6.2 yards per carry. He was a first-team All-Pro that year. That's what led to him getting paid as a top 10 wide receiver at the time. But the following year, he played in 13 games, 632 receiving yards. Last year, had more than 1,000 all-purpose yards, 892 yards receiving. This year, he's also missed some time like he has the last 3 years, and he has 468 receiving yards. I think you have to plan ahead and you have to look ahead. And I think that was part of the reason why the Niners admitted to shopping him this offseason. Deebo Samuel said that he had those conversations with his agent, that the Niners approached him about moving him. And I think that went into the Niners' decision to, let's have some foresight like good businesses do. Let's start to plan ahead. Let's draft Ricky Pearsall. Let's draft Jacob Cowing. Let's re-up on Juwan Jennings. And that gives us flexibility where at the time, if they weren't to have signed Brandon Ayuk, obviously they have, then that gives us some flexibility there. If we want to move off of Deebo at some point in the future, we can afford to do that, and they can draft a wide receiver in the 2025 draft. I've talked a lot about how, given the current construction of this roster, getting expensive, getting a little bit older, the window starting to close for some of the veteran core players on this team. They're going to have to make some tough emotional and financial decisions. They did it this past offseason with Eric Armstead. They might do it in the future with the player like Deebo Samuel or Kyle Juszczyk. I had thrown out George Kittle's name in the past, but I think he's just playing too well to move off of him. But he's going into the final year of his contract next year. And this is what football organizations are oftentimes faced with. If there's a player that they move off of in order to save some coin, I think it might be Deebo. And in the NFL draft, year in and year out, you are looking at some uber talented wide receivers who are able to come in right from the get-go and have very big impacts. Would this offense be the same without Deebo? I don't think so, because he's used as that chess piece, but I do think that he is somewhat replaceable. I had mentioned this offseason, people were coming at my neck, but he continues to be floated in these conversations, and the Niners themselves put him in those conversations.
His future is going to be riveting to see where he goes and how it all plays out. I think he's going to stay one more year, but we'll see. Ray from Fresno says all 49er wins are to teams under 500. Are they going to the playoffs? Playoffs. I think the 49ers are probably going to have a big second half and go to the playoffs. Outrun Arizona, Seattle, and the Rams to do so. I'll have them in, but I think it's going to be very, very close. There's no margin for error. They have to win the winnable games, and that one of them's on Sunday for sure. Do you see the Niners as a playoff team, and do you see Detroit as far and away the best team in the NFC? Or do you – I think the 49ers can literally go on the road and beat any of the playoff contenders in the NFC on the road. I really believe that.
Totally agree. Now, because they choked that game away against the Rams and the Cardinals, you just mentioned it, they do not have a lot of wiggle room. And the upcoming games coming up in the division where you have Seahawks, Rams, Cardinals again, huge games. And these other games are going to be massive too in the NFC. Going on the road, having to take on the Green Bay Packers, because the NFC North is so loaded with the Lions, Vikings, and Packers. These wild card spots are few and far between. And so you can't really afford to lose a lot of these games in the division and in the NFC. Honestly, this division could come down to week 18 against the Cardinals on the road. Winner takes the NFC West. Loser does not make the playoffs, because the NFC North is probably going to get 3 teams. The NFC East might get 2 with Philadelphia and Washington. And so the Niners have won more than 70% of their games after the bye week the last 3 years. Kyle Shanahan's teams always round into form in November, December, January. That's when they start to find their groove. The Niners are capable of doing that. But as we saw last week, as we've seen this year, they have mastered the art of shooting themselves in the foot. And they can't shoot themselves in the foot because they simply can't afford to. So going to be fascinating the rest of the way. I'm with you, though. I think that the Niners can go on the road and beat Detroit. I don't really think that Jared Goff is a huge threat in a massive game, especially on the road. But I think the Niners can win on the road in Detroit. I worry about how Philadelphia matches up against San Francisco with Philly's offensive line and defensive line. They might be able to wear down the Niners, but I think San Francisco can easily win that game because last year they had the book out on Jalen Hurts, and they can beat Minnesota. They can beat Atlanta. They can beat Green Bay. And that's why I continue to say, if Brock Purdy plays well, if the Niners play up to their level, they can be in New Orleans in February. I firmly believe that.
Wouldn't that be awesome? Dude, how great would that be? If we go to New Orleans, if the Niners go to New Orleans in February, we're going out. We're going out. I'm buying you drinks.
And we're doing so much content all over.
Oh my God.
Place. Yeah.
We're hitting dinners. We're having fried alligator. We're doing shots. We're going in that bar that goes in a circle. We're going everywhere. Yeah. John Lynch was asked today, we're obviously a lot of the topics we're jumping on is, John Lynch, because John Lynch spoke on KNBR this morning about an hour ago, and this is the latest breaking stuff. And he was asked about, balancing out the running back workload, and that's been a big theme this week. McCaffrey came back. He looked great, but then Garendo got 1 touch and Mason got 1 touch, and people were like, well, what's going on? And Lynch was asked about, balancing out the workload, and he's like, I think it just depends on the game. I promise those guys will get their opportunities. They've earned the right to get the ball. And then he went on to say that he likes Garendo, he likes Mason, he even likes Patrick Taylor's potential as a runner from scrimmage. What do you think, Chase? I mean, to me, if I could say one thing to Shanahan, it's like, don't forget about Garendo and Mason. It's like, you really, last year you almost won the Super Bowl. If you spotted Christian a little bit more in the regular season, maybe you get it done. I don't know that you can get to the finish line with Bosa or with Christian if their usage doesn't get changed a little bit. I want to see, 15 carries for McCaffrey, but I want to see 10 carries for Mason, and I want to see 5 carries for Garendo. I want to see all 3 guys get touches. Garendo's a game breaker, and Mason is no picnic to tackle. I realize CMC's great, but come on, we got to spread it around. That's my thought on it. How do you see it?
I was pounding the table going into, last week saying, Kyle Shanahan, they have to manage Christian McCaffrey's workload a little bit more. In 2022, they traded for McCaffrey because they needed a running back. They didn't have a lot of depth. Elijah Mitchell's been injured his entire career. Last year, they didn't have running back depth. Elijah Mitchell was injured once again, and they didn't trust Jordan Mason, This year, though, they are deep at running back, and all of these running backs have ability. It was the 3rd time that McCaffrey wore pads in 8 weeks. He's coming off bilateral Achilles tendonitis. He has 100+ all-purpose yards. That's great, but he plays 54 of 61 snaps. Now, from Kyle Shanahan's standpoint, he's looking at a unique one-of-one player who's terrific as a runner, so smooth as a route runner, so talented as a pass catcher. The stutter go wheel route, great throw by Brock Purdy. How about the Kyle Shanahan or the center field Willie Mays type of nature from Christian McCaffrey to run under that football, and a good play call from Kyle Shanahan. Brock has pressure right in his face. He lofts that ball beautifully downfield. It was tremendous. No other running back, I don't think, on that roster is capable of making that play. But as far as running the ball goes, Jordan Mason statistically has been one of the top running backs in the game. I love the physicality that he brings to the running back position, and he can wear the opposing defense down and really just take their will. I look at a player like Isaac Garendo. The more carries that he gets, the better that he gets. By no means am I comparing him to Saquon Barkley, but Saquon all year, he's averaging about 4 yards per carry in the first half, 7 yards per carry in the second half. With more carries, he gets more explosive. We've seen that with Garendo. With more carries, he gets a little bit more explosive, and the game starts to slow down a little bit for him. And I think that he is just capable of breaking off a big run at any moment in the game. Now, do I agree with giving him a red zone carry coming in cold? That's his only carry of the game, which is what Kyle Shanahan did. I don't agree with that. The fact that Jordan Mason was barely used at all, I don't agree with that. I think that the Niners should manage Christian McCaffrey's workload for the reasons of keeping him healthy, because you look into the future, his contract situation being what it is, but also it's a different pace, it's a different feel that you pose to the defense, and these players can play. So I agree. I hope they go with a little bit more of a running back rotation. Again, it's hard to take McCaffrey on the field because on top of him being so versatile, he's a great pass protector as well. But you have to have the long game in mind when you think about his workload.
I mean, you're the coach, Shanahan. He's the player. I keep hearing, well, Christian wants this and Christian wants that. You're the coach.
Yeah.
This guy played 56 of the 64 offensive snaps. He had 19 touches last week, 13 carries, 6 receptions, and he faced a stacked box on 52.8% of his rushing attempts.
Yep.
So this guy ran into a wall most of the day. And by the way, that 52.8% rush attempts into a stacked box, that was the highest share of any running back in the league in week 10.
Yeah.
So, I mean, my goodness, do you want this guy to be there in January, or do you want 3 great games? You want 3 great games in November? Is that what this is about? Or are you going to use all your backs and get through January? I mean, to me, if there's one thing that the Niners don't look at the same at this year. They're not as deep. Their D-line's not as deep, but this is a spot where they have depth and they're just not using it. And it's like,
Yep.
if you don't have depth, it's like, I understand why you're overusing Bosa. I understand why you're overusing Floyd. I don't understand why you're overusing McCaffrey.
Yeah.
Makes
No,
no
I
sense.
totally agree. Yeah. It's management malpractice to a certain degree. Again, like you didn't have the running back depth in 2022 and in 2023. You have the luxury of that. Kyle Shanahan's probably feeling some pressure too. He's looking at that game last week. We're 4-4. We have to get this victory. We got to get to 5-4. They haven't given themselves any wiggle room by blowing the Cardinals game, blowing the Rams game. They're trying to maintain, striking distance with the Arizona Cardinals. But look, if Christian McCaffrey were to suffer a worse injury to that Achilles, you have him locked up through 2027. You gave him guaranteed money, and you have talented players. Use your talented players. You've done it with your rookies, so do it with your running backs.